قائد الإطفاء، الوضع الهندسي حرج.
جميع الأفراد المتاحين على أهبة الاستعداد. هيا بنا.
Long before anyone argued online about which streaming platform had the best sci-fi lineup, long before a certain caped Avenger owned every multiplex on the planet, one small, underfunded television show quietly decided to imagine a future where humanity had grown up. It debuted on NBC on September 8, 1966, wedged into a Thursday night schedule that nobody expected it to survive. Its sets wobbled. Its aliens were sometimes just actors in repainted bathrobes. Its ratings, for most of its run, ranged from mediocre to genuinely bad. And yet Star Trek, the original series, went on to become one of the most influential pieces of storytelling of the 20th century. A show that didn't just entertain audiences, but quietly rewired how they thought about the future, about each other, and about what television was even capable of doing. What most people know about Star Trek is the surface, the phasers, the Vulcan salute, the split infinitive into boldly go. What most people don't know is the strange, chaotic, occasionally hilarious story of how the show actually got made. A production held together by duct tape, static electricity, network panic, and a small group of people who believed, against all evidence, that they were building something that would outlast them. Consider the environment the show was actually made in. This was a decade defined by assassinations, a deeply unpopular and escalating war, and a civil rights movement that was reshaping American life in real time, whether television executives wanted to acknowledge it or not. Into that environment walked a science fiction adventure series with a multiracial bridge crew, a woman in a position of real authority, and a Russian officer serving alongside Americans at the height of the Cold War, choices that were nowhere near as safe or as obvious at the time as they look in hindsight. None of it happened by accident, and very little of it happened easily. Every one of the 20 facts that follows is really a small case study in how much creative ambition can survive inside a production with almost no money, a nervous network, and a ticking clock toward cancellation. Here are 20 of the strangest, least-known facts about the original Star Trek, the show that almost wasn't, that almost got canceled twice, and that somehow ended up changing the future it was only pretending to imagine. When Gene Roddenberry first pitched his idea for a science fiction series to network executives, the name William Shatner didn't appear anywhere in his notes. His captain was a man named Christopher Pike, and the actor cast to play him was Jeffrey Hunter, a leading man best known at the time for playing Jesus Christ in the 1961 biblical epic King of Kings. Hunter's Pike, who appeared in the unaired first pilot titled The Cage, was quieter and more brooding than the captain audiences would eventually come to know, a man weighed down by command rather than energized by it. After that pilot was shot, Hunter chose not to continue with the project. The exact reasons have been debated for decades. Some accounts point to his wife's reluctance about a long-term television commitment. Others suggest Hunter himself wanted to keep building a film career rather than tie himself to a weekly series. Whatever the truth, the role went back on the market, and Roddenberry rebuilt the concept around a different kind of captain entirely, one played by a young Canadian stage actor named William Shatner, whose energy, physicality, and theatrical instincts reshaped the entire tone of the show. Where Hunter's Pike had been introspective, Shatner's Kirk was impulsive, romantic, and constantly walking a tightrope between duty and instinct. It is genuinely difficult to imagine Star Trek's cultural legacy built around the version of a character that almost existed. Jeffrey Hunter never got to see what the franchise became. He died in 1969 at just 42 years old, following a fall and a head injury, the same year Star Trek's original run ended. Footage from his unaired pilot wasn't wasted, though, which is a story in itself that we'll come back to shortly. It's worth sitting with how differently the entire franchise might have unfolded. Hunter's Pike carried a weariness that suited a more meditative, philosophical version of the show, closer in spirit to the kind of restrained, cerebral science fiction that networks in 1965 were nervous about greenlighting at all. Shatner, by contrast, brought a swagger and an emotional volatility that gave the writers a completely different toolkit to work with. A captain who could fall in love in one episode and talk a computer into self-destructing in the next. The show that eventually captured the public imagination was built, in large part, around that specific combination of bravado and vulnerability, a combination that simply didn't exist in the character as Hunter had played him. Casting decisions rarely get credited with reshaping the cultural trajectory of an entire genre, but this is about as close to an exception as television history offers. Few characters in the history of television are as instantly recognizable as Spock, the pointed ears, the arched eyebrow, the unshakable calm. But the version of Spock that very nearly made it to air looked nothing like the character audiences fell in love with. In Roddenberry's earliest concept notes, Spock was imagined as an unmistakably alien presence, and one of the ideas on the table was giving him a deep red complexion, paired with the same angular ears and features that survived into the final design. Early concept art leaned hard into an almost demonic look, striking, unsettling, and deliberately far from human. The intent was to make absolutely clear, at a glance, that this character did not belong to Earth. Two practical problems killed the idea. The first was technical. In 1966, a large share of American households still owned black and white television sets, and test footage showed that red makeup simply collapsed into a flat, murky black under monochrome cameras, muddying the performance rather than enhancing it. The second problem was one of perception. Network executives, already nervous about how a strange new science fiction show would be received by advertisers and parents, worried that a red-skinned, sharp-eared alien would read to audiences as something closer to a devil than an extraterrestrial, hardly the image a family-hour drama wanted associated with one of its leads. The solution was a much subtler greenish-yellow tint, just enough to suggest something not quite human, without triggering either problem. Ironically, once the show did air in color, the tint was so understated that many viewers barely registered it at all. It was the ears, the eyebrows, and Leonard Nimoy's performance that ultimately carried the character's alienness, proof that sometimes restraint reads louder than spectacle. Ask a Star Trek fan to name the show's single most influential piece of technology, and a huge number will say the transporter, the ability to dissolve a human being into energy and reassemble them somewhere else instantly. It feels like the boldest idea science fiction ever proposed. It was actually a solution to a much more boring problem: money. Roddenberry's earliest plans for the show had the Enterprise landing on the surface of nearly every planet the crew visited, the same way earlier science fiction serials had always depicted space travel. It quickly became clear that filming a starship landing week after week on a television budget from the mid-1960s was simply not feasible. Building and filming shuttlecraft models for constant use was similarly out of reach. According to accounts from the production team documented in The Making of Star Trek, Roddenberry himself later said that landing the ship every episode would have blown the entire budget just on that one shot alone. The fix the special effects team landed on was elegant in its cheapness: aluminum powder dropped in front of a black background, filmed with a camera running in reverse and layered with a shimmering light effect. The cost was a tiny fraction of what a shuttle landing sequence would have required, and the storytelling benefit turned out to be even bigger. The transporter let writers drop characters straight into a new location by the second page of a script, without wasting screen time on travel. There's an added layer to this story that rarely gets told. The transporter's limitations were also deliberately designed as narrative tools, not just technical ones. Early documentation described the device as requiring a tremendous amount of power and working only across short, line-of-sight distances, restrictions that let writers strand characters on planets whenever the plot needed tension, without having to invent a new excuse every week. In other words, the very thing that saved the production money also became one of its most reliable storytelling engines, generating conflict out of a limitation rather than despite one. What began as a cost-cutting shortcut became one of the single most iconic and scientifically debated ideas the franchise ever produced. Physicists still argue about quantum teleportation today, and university research groups have spent real grant money investigating whether any version of matter-energy conversion at that scale could ever be physically possible. The lineage of all of that public fascination traces back to a production team in 1966 that genuinely could not afford to show a starship landing on a planet. Most television pilots get one shot. If a network passes, that's usually the end of it. Star Trek got something almost unheard of in the industry, a second chance, but only after its first attempt was rejected outright. That first pilot, The Cage, starring Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Pike, was screened for NBC executives in early 1965. The response was blunt. The story was considered too slow, too philosophical, and lacking the kind of action executives believed audiences wanted from a space adventure. There were also concerns, well documented in later interviews with the production team, about the prominence of a female first officer character, played by Majel Barrett, in a command role that some executives felt 1960s audiences weren't ready to accept. NBC declined to pick up the pilot as delivered, but in a genuinely unusual move, commissioned a second pilot rather than killing the project entirely. Roddenberry went back to the drawing board, reworked the tone, replaced Pike with Kirk, and delivered a livelier, more action-oriented approach that became the show audiences eventually knew. But the rejected pilot wasn't wasted. Roddenberry later folded most of its footage into a two-part first-season episode called The Menagerie, using a framing story to justify the flashback structure. That episode went on to win the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, meaning the pilot NBC rejected as fundamentally broken ended up as some of the only Star Trek footage ever to receive one of science fiction's most prestigious honors. In the racially charged landscape of 1960s American television, Nichelle Nichols was doing something quietly radical simply by showing up to work. As Lieutenant Uhura, she played one of the first black women on American television to hold a position of genuine authority and competence, rather than a subservient or comedic role. She was a bridge officer on the flagship of an interstellar fleet, treated by the show, week after week, as simply another skilled professional. Despite that, after the first season, Nichols seriously considered leaving the show. She had ambitions in musical theater, and the workload and modest size of her role left her wanting more. She actually submitted her resignation to Roddenberry. Then, an NAACP fundraising event. She was told that one of her biggest admirers wanted to meet her, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., according to Nichols' own later recollections. King told her that Uhura mattered enormously, that for the first time, young black children watching television could see someone who looked like them portrayed not as a stereotype, but as a dignified professional serving at the highest levels of human achievement, centuries in the future. He reportedly told her she could not leave the role because she wasn't just playing a character. She was representing a possibility. Nichols withdrew her resignation soon after. She spoke about that conversation for the rest of her life as one of the defining moments that reshaped how she understood the weight of what she was doing on screen every week. Her legacy extended well beyond the show itself. In later decades, Nichols worked directly with NASA on astronaut recruitment drives aimed at attracting more women and people of color into the space program, a role she took on partly because of how many people had told her that Uhura made them believe a future in space was actually open to them. Several astronauts who went on to fly real missions, including some of the first women and first black astronauts in NASA's history, later credited watching Nichols on screen as a formative influence on their own ambitions. It's a rare case of a fictional role on a low-budget 1960s television show producing a measurable, traceable effect on real careers and real institutions decades later. Today, Leonard Nimoy and Spock are so thoroughly fused in the public imagination that it's hard to imagine one without the other. But in the earliest stages of production, Nimoy himself wasn't at all convinced the role would work, or that he even wanted it. His biggest worry was the physical design, the pointed ears, the arched brows, the subtly alien features. Nimoy feared audiences would see a monster rather than a character, that he would be reduced to a novelty in rubber prosthetics, rather than taken seriously as an actor. He also struggled, at least early on, with the emotional discipline the role demanded. Nimoy was a trained, expressive performer, and playing a character who suppressed almost all outward emotion required him to rebuild his acting instincts from the ground up, finding depth in restraint rather than in expression. What changed his mind, ultimately, was the audience's response. Rather than recoiling from an emotionless alien, viewers found something compelling underneath the logic, a quiet warmth, a sense of internal conflict between Spock's human and Vulcan halves, that made the character feel more human, not less. Nimoy's own complicated relationship with the role is neatly captured in the titles of his two memoirs, published decades apart. The first was called I Am Not Spock, the second, years later, I Am Spock. The distance between those two titles says almost everything about the journey. On November 22, 1968, an episode called Plato's Stepchildren aired a scene in which Kirk and Uhura kiss, a moment frequently cited as one of the first scripted interracial kisses broadcast on American primetime television. What's less well known is exactly how hard the network fought to prevent it from happening the way it did. Network executives were nervous about backlash, particularly from affiliate stations in the American South. Their proposed solution was to reframe the kiss as something the characters didn't choose. In the episode's plot, telekinetic aliens force Kirk and Uhura together against their will, which gave nervous affiliates a built-in excuse to describe the scene as mind control rather than romance if pressed. Shatner and Nichols, however, reportedly had other plans on set. According to accounts from both actors, they deliberately flubbed the alternate takes in which their heads remained apart, forcing the director to use the footage where they actually turned toward one another. The network got the disclaimer it wanted written into the plot. The actors got the moment they wanted captured on film. Nichols later recalled receiving a letter from a white viewer in the South who told her that watching that scene had made him question long-held beliefs he'd grown up with. A single kiss, filmed on a low-budget science fiction show, reportedly reshaped how at least one viewer saw the world around him. A small human-scale example of exactly the kind of impact Roddenberry hoped the show could have. Even the alternate, unforced version of the scene was reportedly filmed as a backup, in case the network insisted on airing something safer for nervous affiliates. Different accounts over the years have offered slightly different versions of exactly how the footage was ultimately selected for broadcast, which is common for behind-the-scenes stories that only surface decades later through convention panels and memoirs rather than contemporaneous documentation. What's consistent across nearly every retelling, though, is the basic shape of the story. A network anxious about backlash, two actors determined to make sure the moment landed as written, and a scene that ended up remembered far more for its courage than for the loophole the network built around it. Star Trek was never a ratings powerhouse. After its first season, NBC began quietly signaling that cancellation was on the table. After the second season, those signals got louder and far more serious. What happened next had essentially no precedent in television history at the time. Organized fan campaigns, coordinated through letter-writing drives, college campus petitions, and even small in-person demonstrations, sent an enormous volume of mail flooding into NBC's offices, all without a single email, forum post, or social media account, because none of that infrastructure existed yet. It was collective action built entirely out of stamps, typewriters, and stubbornness. It worked. NBC renewed the show for a third season, a decision reportedly announced publicly at a science fiction convention, in what was one of the earliest visible instances of organized audience pressure reversing a major network's cancellation plans. The third season, however, arrived with a reduced budget and a punishing Friday night time slot that networks traditionally used to bury shows they'd already given up on. Star Trek was finally canceled for good in 1969. But that third season mattered more than anyone at the time realized, because it pushed the show's total episode count past the threshold needed for lucrative syndication.